Hello there, and welcome to another tutorial. And this time I'd like to discuss the difference between bitmap graphics and vector graphics. Now, these are the two main types of 2D graphics available on computer systems and phones and everything else. They have a number of fundamental differences, and which is strengths and weaknesses for both types of graphics, and this means that they tend to have uses for particular things. So if we start with bitmaps, so you're probably most familiar with bitmaps through taking photos, perhaps on your phone or your digital camera. And bitmaps are essentially made up of pixels, which are the square units on your screen or your tablet screen, whatever screen you're using, your laptop or your phone. So let's have a look at an example of a pixel image. I'm just going to go into a drawing package and just draw a squiggle. And then what we'll find is if we zoom in, we start to get some what you might call pixelated image. So it's a bit jagged around the edge. You keep on zooming in and it actually produces this grid. So you can see that the image is made up of individual elements or pictal elements or pixels. So you can see as you zoom in, you start to lose quality. So this is one of the key characteristics of bitmap graphics, is that might look good from far away, but as you zoom in more and more, you start to lose quality until you're left with the individual pixels themselves. The fact that bitmaps are made up of pixels also means that the files that they produce are actually quite large. So I write large file. Large files, and as we've seen, if you zoom in, there's a limited quality of the image as we zoom in. Now let's take a different approach and look at vector graphics. So I've got an example here which I've actually exported from a word processor, and as we can see in this case, because it's a vector image, we can zoom in as much as we like. So I'll drag a box around with zoom in. We can zoom in as much as we want. Zoom in on the V. And you can see we can't zoom in any further. But as you can see, this image really retains its very, very crisp quality no matter how much we zoom in. And also it doesn't take up much space on the hard drive. Let's go back to our table. So vectors essentially are storing the image as a mathematical description of objects, and each object has its own properties. So you might have, okay, so this is a square and it's coloured red and it has dotted lines around the edge. Now, because it's a mathematical description, that means that the file size will actually be quite small. And it's a small file because it's not made up of individual pixels describing the data. It's made up of objects describing the individual shapes. So it's up to the computer program that's interpreting this vector image to interpret the mathematical description and turn it into the image that we see on the screen. And this means that you can zoom in ad infinitum as much as you want. With vectors, there's no loss of quality when we zoom in, whereas with bitmap images, we're really dependent on the original quality of the picture. For instance, how many megapixels was the camera that it was taken with, or what are the dimensions of the file produced in your drawing program. These fundamental differences mean that each image type is useful for particular purposes or applications. So for instance, as we've discussed already, bitmaps are ideal for photos which have a lot of detail in them, a lot of fine detail perhaps. Also, for similar reasons, they might be used in games or films as the textures we see on objects to give them a particular texture or look or feel to them. In contrast, vector graphics are more useful for things like logos perhaps, or blueprints. Things like logos or blueprints, you don't want a loss of quality when you zoom in. You want them to be very sharp. And have very precise corners and curves and edges. And you don't want that loss of quality that you would get with bitmaps. So a practical tip is that each format tends to have their own file extensions that you can help to remember which type they are. So with Bitmaps, there's the original file extension was .bmp, or short for bitmap. But the more familiar ones might be your JPEGs and your GIFs, which may or may not be animated. Then over here on the vector side, you also have some characteristic file extensions, and a couple of these are SVG and EPS. Also, PDF files have vector information in them, as I've shown you the text when I zoomed in. So I hope that's been a useful introduction for you of the differences between bitmap graphics and vector graphics. So just a quick summary. With the bitmap you can zoom in only a certain amount, and then you start to see these jagged edges and the individual pixels themselves. So I could pick up a paintbrush again and do a bit of painting. You can see the individual pixels coming up there. So if you're zoomed right in, you really lose that detail. Whereas in contrast, if you have a look at vector images, it's very crisp, very good for text, very good for logos and design. And with the vector graphics, you can zoom in as much as you want, or as much as the computer will let you, and you'll keep that lovely crisp detail, which is very good for text and blueprints and that kind of thing. So thanks very much for joining me for another tutorial, and I hope that was useful for you all. Thanks a lot.